Okay, welcome everyone to Pathways Through the Orchard. Tonight is Parshat Tezavah. This is the second Torah portion that is dealing with the Mishkan, the tabernacle that was built in the desert, which became the prototype of the temple in Jerusalem. Tonight we have a number of insights, so we'll get right to it. For those who were here last week, or if you weren't, you always have the chance to see the video from last week. We discussed that in Parshat Truma, the word li, to me, is very important, because it says, "V'yikhu li truma," take for me a truma. And then it says, the asu li mikdash, make for me a mikdash, v'shachanti betocham, and I will dwell within them. So we discussed the word li, we discussed about the contribution, and I want to add now a whole other layer to this idea. This is coming from Rav Ginsburg. And first, I'll just remind everyone what Rashi says. Rashi is a one-word description of the word li, to me. He says, lishmi, for my name, for the sake of my name. That's what Rashi says. That's what it means. Take for me, or make for me a mikdash. We learned that the Zohar says, goes one step further, and says, when it says take for me, we could read it, take me. That when we give and we emulate God and his attribute of chesed and giving, we are taking God within ourselves. That's what the Zohar says. So in another place, Rashi says, any place it says li, to me, meaning God is saying this, it's for me, it's to me, it represents something that's forever. So the reason I'm going back over this is because in our Parsha, Tezavah, we have the word li many times, and most of them have to do with the Kohanim. That God says, take for me the Kohanim. The Kohanim are mine. And so Rav Ginsburg points out that in the Chumash, in the 5 books of Moses, this concept of God saying it's for me appears 13 times. Now, again, going back to last week, we made a point, a very strong point, that Rashi points out that when it says, take from me a contribution, there are 13 different materials that were taken as a donation to build the Mishkan. We pointed out that 13 is the numerical value of the word one and of love. So we see that the tabernacle is God's expression of love. And it's also our expression of love for God and God's expression of love for us. It's a meeting place where these two loves can come together. So here, Rav Ginsburg points out that this word li appears 13 times. And we also learn the idea that when we put the Mishkan together, the Torah says, V'haya ha-mishkan echad. And then the Mishkan will become one. It will manifest, express God's oneness. In other words, the experience of being in the tabernacle or in the temple was an experience of feeling God's oneness, God's presence, the Shekhinah. Asuli mikdash v'shachanti betocham. Make for me a dwelling place, and I will dwell within them. So the word dwell is the root of the idea of God's divine presence called the Shekhinah. It's the same root. Then Rav Ginsburg points out, now remember, Rashi says, what does li mean? Lishmi, for my sake, for my name. So amazingly enough, in the whole Tanakh, so the word lishmi, in other words, God saying, do something for my name, also appears exactly 13 times. And it's virtually all in context of the first temple, of Shlomo, King Solomon building the first temple. So here you have the word li, which applies mostly to the tabernacle, and lishmi to the temple in Jerusalem. And they're both 13 times. And amazingly enough, Rashi, that's the only word he says to explain what li means, is lishmi. So Rav Ginsburg points out this idea that anytime it says li, it's forever. And yet when we look at the temple, both temples were destroyed. But there the word is lishmi. And the tradition is that when the first temple was built, they used the tabernacle until that time. It was in many different places. The place it was the longest was in Shiloh. It was there for approximately 350 years. It was in Shiloh, but it was in a number of other places as well. But until the temple was built, we were using the Mishkan, the tabernacle. And so we're told that when the temple was built, everything in the Mishkan was hidden somewhere under the Temple Mount. To this day, we don't know exactly, but the tradition is it wasn't just discarded, and it wasn't just, some of it was, in a sense, became part of the temple, but many of the ingredients of the Mishkan were hidden away. And so Rav Ginsburg points out that the tabernacle still exists. We don't know where it is, but it still exists. And so he says that when it says li, yasu li mikdash, li represents the four-letter name of God, meaning the more essential, the essence of God, where lishmi, for my name, represents more the name Elohim in nature. There's a verse that says, Hashem Elohim, Shemesh Umagain, Hashem Elohim. The sun and its shield is Yud-Kei Vav-Kei Elohim. In other words, the sun is a symbol of the essence of God's light. It is the ma'or. It is from where the light comes from. It's a source of the light. And Elohim, as the presence of God, is the shield, is the light that's emanating from the sun. It's connected to the source, but it's not exactly the source. Shemesh umagain Hashem Elohim. So Rav Ginsburg points out that the Mishkan lasts forever. The Mishkan, the temple was destroyed. And the idea is that li, for me, represents the essence. But the essence of God was incorporated into the temple. And so this is just a beautiful idea of these two words, both occurring exactly 13 times. And we said that 13 is the 13 materials that made up the Mishkan. And the word echad and ahava. So another thing we pointed out last week was the parsha begins Truma by Yedaber Hashem el Moshe lemor. And God spoke to Moshe saying. And we pointed out that this verse occurs 70 times. God speaking to Moshe saying 70 times. There is no other verse that's repeated so constantly. And 70, of course, represents the Shivim Panim LeTorah, the 70 faces of the Torah. But then we mentioned that there's one mirror image where it actually says, Vayedaber Moshe el Hashem lemor. It's like a reversal. 70 times it says God spoke to Moshe saying, but one time it says Moshe spoke to God saying. So here I just want to point out that there are two verses where the word li appears, but it's from our side. Here we've been looking at God saying, take for me, or make for my name, li and lishmi. But in the Song of Songs, there's a very well-known verse. It says, Ani ledodi, ledodi li. I am to be my beloved, and my beloved is to me. But here, we're the ones speaking the li. In all the other cases we've been talking about, it's God saying li, for me. But here we're saying, I am to my beloved, and my beloved is to me. And then there's another verse that actually is a mirror of that verse, where it says, Dodi li va'ani lo. I am to my beloved, and my beloved, and I am to him. So here we see the reciprocity of our relationship with Hashem, this love relationship, this feeling of being one with God. Like we say in Mincha of Shabbos, Ata echad, v'shimcha echad, u'mi k'amcha Yisrael goy echad ba'oretz. You are one, and your name is one. And who is like your people, one nation in the earth? So here again, we see that the purpose of the Mishkan is, again, the word Mishkan comes from Shechina, the Shechanti betocham, a dwelling place for God. Okay. Okay, so the beginning of this parsha, the whole parsha has to do with the Kohanim. There's a short introduction that I'm going to talk about now, about taking pure olive oil in order to light the menorah. After that, about a half of the Torah portion describes the clothing of the high priest and the regular priest, the Kohanim. And the last part of the parsha describes the consecration of the Kohanim. Because remember, it says, God says, take for me the Kohanim, the Kahen li. They will become Kohanim for me. And so there was a whole ritual of consecration that they went through that this week's parsha describes. So now let's go back to the very beginning. And this is, God says, have Israel take for you pure olive oil to light the menorah. And the lighting the menorah is described as a ner tamid, an everlasting light. So this obviously is very connected to what we're saying is the Mishkan. Over and over again, it uses the word li, take for me. And so here God is saying, take for me the Kohanim, and that li means everlasting. And so the menorah is called the Ner Tamid, an everlasting light. And we're going to see in a minute the importance of this, but in every synagogue in the world, there is today it's an electric light usually, but there'll be some fixture in the synagogue that is lit all the time. And this represents the Ner Tamid. It's always lit. This is how we bring the menorah into today's synagogue. So what I want to do now is explain 7, call it degrees or levels of enclothement. Hopefully everyone is following the Living with the Times series. And there I talk about the clothing and the importance of the concept of enclothement. So we're not talking just about the clothing of the Kohanim. We're talking about a much bigger concept called enclothement. And there I explain how God is enclosed in the world, and how the soul is enclosed in the body, and how energy is enclosed in matter, and how spirituality is enclosed in physicality. So I want to take the same idea now and go through 7 degrees of the light, because we're talking about the menorah, and the menorah had 7 branches. So we're going to see relatively quickly 7 almost descents, or 7 manifestations or enclothement of the light of God. So we're going to start with the concept called the infinity of God, is called the Ein Sof. Literally means without end. Ein is the nothingness from which everything comes into being. This is compared to the womb, that from we'll call it the primordial space or darkness of nothingness comes everything. So the first thing that comes from the Ein Sof, and this is the first enclothement, is the Or Ein Sof, the light, the infinite light. But as we've discussed many times in a deep way, there is a primordial darkness that precedes the light. And again, this is symbolically the darkness of the womb from which all birth comes from. So from the infinite nothingness, again, when we say nothingness, we have to realize that this is actually the source of everything. But from the infinite nothing comes the light, the infinite light, the Or Ein Sof. And then from the Or Ein Sof, infinite light becomes enclosed in finite light, in the finite worlds. That God creates all of the spiritual and our physical material world, but they are finite, even though it stretches the imagination to imagine what they're talking now about of tens of billions of galaxies, each one containing tens of billions of stars, and each galaxy stretching more light years than we can even imagine. And so the universe in our mind appears to be infinite, but from God's perspective, it is finite. And so from the Ein Sof to the Or Ein Sof, from the Or Ein Sof comes physical light. And then that physical light is enclosed in the menorah in the Mishkan. But this physical light is also enclosing infinite light. And then from the Mishkan, that's the third step here, that light is manifest in the temple. Because at a certain point, as we mentioned, the Mishkan is hidden away, and the temple is built in Jerusalem. And so that becomes the fourth enclosement. And then the temples are destroyed. But we know that the synagogue today has incorporated all of the physical elements of the temple, and our prayers enclose and translate all of the service that the Kohanim and the Levim did in the temple. And so here we go from Mishkan to temple to synagogue. But then there's another level of enclosement that's even closer. I was going to say closer to home, and that's exactly the point, where our homes become like temples. Our table becomes the altar. On Shabbat, we have the two loaves of bread, which are like the table and the showbread in the temple. Lighting candles in Shabbat become the menorah. It's customary to have flowers, and that's the good smell of the ketoret. And all of this makes a dwelling place for the Shekhinah. And then the last, that's the sixth stop along the way. And the last, in a sense, is the most important one. And that goes back to the original statement when God says, V'asuli mikdash v'shachanti b'tocham. Make for me a holy place, and I will dwell within them, within each and every person. So that's where the body becomes the dwelling place of the divine soul. And the divine soul is an actual part of God above. And God above is the infinite light and is the Ein Sof. So here I'm going to review very, very quickly. We go from Ein Sof, from infinite to the or Ein Sof, to the infinite light. The infinite light becomes manifest in finite light. This finite light becomes manifest in the menorah, in the Mishkan. That light then becomes the prototype and is contained in the temple in Jerusalem. The temple, after its destruction, is now contained in the synagogue, which is actually called the Mikdash Ma'at, a miniature temple. And then the temple is manifest in our homes. And then ultimately, all of this is manifest, is expressed in the human being, in the soul, in the body. And those are 7 steps, and that represents the 7 branches of the menorah. 7 branches of this light that goes from infinity to an infinite light, to finite light, to the light of the menorah in the Mishkan, the light of the menorah in the temple, the Ner Tamid, that's how we started all of this. At the lighting of the menorah is called an everlasting light. And that is in our synagogues today. And in our homes, we bring the light of God, and especially it's symbolized by lighting the candles of Shabbat and holidays. And ultimately, it is the light of God within each and every person. So this is the menorah manifest through all the worlds, through 7 levels of the world. Okay, now our next insight is going to be about what's called the Choshen Mishpat. As I said before, the half of this parsha is about the clothing of the high priest and the regular priest. The regular Kohanim have 4 different garments, and the Kohen Gadol has an additional 4 garments, 8 altogether. And the Torah goes through great detail of the way that they were made, how they were worn, what colors, the dimensions, and full of meaningful symbolism and how we can apply these ideas. I'll direct everyone to Orchard of Delights and Fruits of the Orchard. Remember, my point in Pathways is to break new ground. So I can't always go over everything that I've said in the previous Orchard series. But one of the clothings or the ornaments of the high priest is called the Choshen Mishpat. And this is that the Kohen Gadol had a ma'il, a long robe, and on top of it, there was it was called the ephod. And the ephod was connected with 2 stones, one here and one here. And there were chains, and the chains connected to a square, it was like a pouch. It's like a square pouch. On the square pouch was what's called the Choshen Mishpat, I'm trying to think of the translation of Choshen. Breastplate. Thank you. My wife always comes to my rescue. The breastplate of judgment. That's what it's called. The Choshen Mishpat. The breastplate of judgment. So that breastplate had 12 stones, had 4 rows of 3 stones. Again, all of this is so much to say. But again, it was a pouch. And in the pouch, there was what is called the Urim v'Tumim. Urim comes from the word or. Tumim comes from the word complete. And it's not even known exactly what the Urim and Tumim are. Most people hold that they were names of God that were inscribed and put in this pouch. And on the 12 stones were the names of the 12 tribes. Also on the Shoham stones were the tribes, 6 on one shoulder and 6 on another shoulder. Again, in previous Orchard books, we discussed this in great length. But I want to get to a certain idea here. And that is that we're told that when there were very, very important questions regarding all of Israel, that they would ask a question of the Kohen Gadol, and the letters that were inscribed on the stones of the tribes would start to light up. And an answer would be given from the lit up letters on the Choshen Mishpat. So this is what I want to get to. We want to understand what is happening here. This is a very way out concept, that it was like an oracle. In English, we would use the word oracle. And it wasn't used for private questions. It was only matters that affected Israel. And they would ask the Kohen Gadol, the high priest who was wearing this ephod with the Choshen Mishpat. So we're going to start by looking at the word Choshen. Mishpat means judgment. Choshen means the breastplate. But the three root letters of Choshen is the same as Nachash, the snake. So this becomes very mysterious, that this oracle has the same letters. Choshen has the same letters as Nachash. Now, in the Torah itself, it tells us in a few places that magic and sorcery are forbidden. And the Torah enumerates all kinds of different types of sorcery. Almost all of them were to try to tell the future, and they're forbidden. But here you have a Choshen Mishpat, you have this breastplate of judgment, and in some miraculous way, when a question is asked, the letters would light up and give an answer. So obviously there's a very, very fine line here between what is permitted and what is forbidden. And here we actually have a similar question that's asked about the Kruvim, the two angelic figures that were on the top, on the cover of the Holy Ark in the Holy of Holies. And actually, when the Babylonians came in and they destroyed the temple and they saw these two figures, they were like astounded, because to them it looked like idols. And they couldn't believe that this is what's in the Holy of Holies, these two angelic figures. So again, there's a very, very fine line in general between many things that are permitted and those things that are forbidden. Like we've pointed out many times, there's so many things in the world that are what's called neutral, parv. It depends how they're used. Now here, we made the kruvim because God told us to make the kruvim. So therefore, even though it may appear to someone, especially someone who doesn't understand the oral tradition, it may appear to look like an idol. But since it was commanded by God, then it becomes permitted. So this reminds me, I don't know why I'm thinking of this, a story of the Ropchitzer Rebbe. That one time, one of his students came running to him saying, Rebbe, my father is having a heart attack. What do I do? So the Rebbe said, quick, make him a strong cup of coffee and give it to him. And so the student did that. and he gave the coffee to his father, and whatever the incident was, passed. A couple of weeks later, he comes running again to the Rebbe and says, Rebbe, my father's having a heart attack again. So I gave him strong coffee and it's not helping. And the Rebbe said, you gave him strong coffee, you could kill him. And so it all depends on the circumstance. It all depends on very, very fine lines. So here we have this, again, we're going to call it an oracle, something that seems very magical, and it actually is the same letter as Nachash. And in Hebrew, the word to guess is lenachesh. Like guessing is the same root as Nachash. And there's an incident, if you remember, with Yosef, when Yosef is second most powerful person in Egypt, and the brothers come down, they don't recognize him, and he goes through this whole attempt to get them to do tshuva. And part of it was when he demanded that they bring Benjamin, their youngest brother, down, because they said we have one more brother at home. So as it were, to test them. And so they brought down Benjamin, and it seemed like everything was good and they're all going home. But Yosef on purpose had his cup put into the sack of Benjamin. And when it was found, this is again part of his whole plot to get them to do tshuva. So when they brought back all the brothers, Yosef said, how could you do this? You don't know that I can lenachesh, that I have vision, I have sight. How could you think that I wouldn't know that someone took the cup that I use to see the future? So again, the word lenachesh. And so here, I'd like to go into a very, very important idea, and that is the connection between prophecy and imagination. Because the Nachash is connected to what's called fallen imagination, because he convinced Eve to eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil because he awoke her imagination, and he said, if you eat from the tree, you'll be like God. And so he sparked her imagination, and she went ahead and ate from the tree. And so here we have really an amazing idea from both Maimonides and the Ramchal about prophecy. And both of them write extensively that the ability to have prophecy is based on the imagination. Now, we would think that prophecy comes through the intellect. God comes and gives over certain information to the prophet, and through their intellect, they are able to impart it to other people. But both Maimonides, the Rambam, and the Ramchal write extensively that there is a place for the intellect, but that's not the key place. The key place of prophecy is a rectified sense of imagination. And so here I'm just trying to connect this all to try to understand this Choshen Mishpat and why it has the same letters as Nachash. And here we'll point out something that's well known, that the numerical value of Nachash, the snake, and of Choshen equals Mashiach, 358. It's the same letters, excuse me, the same numerical value of Mashiach and Nachash. And at first glance, it's like, what could be more opposite than the Nachash and the Mashiach? But what they have in common is the sense of imagination. The difference is the Nachash is a fallen, blemished sense of imagination, whereas the Mashiach and a prophet is a rectified sense of imagination. So in Hebrew, the word for imagination is dimayon. That's what imagination means, dimayon. And here we'll see that the root is dam, adam, and dam means blood. So imagination is actually connected in a certain way to the lowest level of a human being, the level of the nachash, the yetzer hara. But when that power of imagination is rectified and purified and made holy, it becomes the vessel for prophecy. And that's why the Arizal said that of all of the sfirot that are the channels for prophecy, we might think maybe Keter, the supraconscious, or Chachma, Bin, and Dat, wisdom, understanding, and knowledge. But the Ari says it's Netzach and Hod, the lower instinctual parts of the soul. Because when that energy is fixed and elevated, it becomes the source of prophecy. So what I'd like to do, and again, this whole idea with the Choshen Mishpat, this is prophecy. The Sanhedrin or the king would come with a question of critical importance to the Jewish people. And they're looking for an answer, in other words, of the future. And so this Choshen Mishpat became a channel of prophecy. So I want to read, I'm going to read from the Guide to the Perplexed. This is Maimonides' great philosophical work, The Guide to the Perplexed. And in it, he speaks extensively about prophecy and divine inspiration. So I'm quoting a translation in English. He says like this: prophecy is, in truth and reality, an emanation sent forth by the divine being through the medium of the active intellect. In the first instance, to man's rational faculty, and then to his imaginative faculty. It is the highest degree and greatest perfection man can attain, and it depends upon the most perfect development of the imaginative faculty. Prophecy is a faculty that cannot in any way be found in a person or acquired by a person through the refining of his mental or moral faculties alone. For even if these were as good and perfect as possible, they would be of no avail unless they were combined with the highest natural excellence of the imaginative faculty. So this is telling us something obviously very deep, that the prophetic experience, in a certain way, it passes through the intellect. And the reason it does is because the way to perfect the imagination is through the intellect. And that's what the Alter Rebbe says, that we've quoted many times, that Hamoach shalit al halev, the mind has to rule over the heart. But here, it's not even the heart. It's the heart is chesed, gevura, and tiferet. Here we're talking about netzach hod, even not lower, but more instinctual, more like from the gut kind of understanding. And so the source of much of what we know about prophecy comes in Parshat Bahalotcha, and this is where Miriam and Aaron seemingly complain to God about Moshe. And God comes and he explains the difference between all the prophets. Moshe, Aaron and Miriam also were prophets, and the difference between them and Moshe. And so, just give me 1 second. So this is what God says. He says like this. This is in Bahalotcha, chapter 12, verse 6. But I'll just say it in English just to save time. So God says to Aaron and Miriam, listen to my words. If there will be prophets of God among you, in a vision I will appear to them. In a dream I will speak to them. Not so my servant Moshe. In all of my house he is the faithful one. Mouth to mouth I speak to him, and I don't do it in riddles or symbolism. So even though this is a short description, again, Maimonides and the Ramchal explain in great depth that all the other prophets, God came to them in a vision, in a dream-like state. It could have been like a real dream or a daydream. We'll call it a daydream, but it's a vision. And that's what we read before, that Maimonides said, all prophecy emanates from a vision from God. It can't be self-induced. It has to be, a person can make themselves ready for prophecy, but he can't bring prophecy upon himself. He can become a fitting vessel. So all the prophets received their prophecy in visions, in riddles, metaphors, allegories, and then through the imaginative faculty in their soul, they were able to then translate it into words that we read in the books of the prophets. But the prophetic experience was an awesome divine revelation that it didn't come necessarily in words. It came in a vision where the prophet sees everything clearly that God is trying to reveal to him or her. But again, the Rambam and the Ramchal make a very important point that it has to come through the imaginative faculty. And so we said before that the word for imagination is dimayon. And it's interesting because it's dam and then yud vav nun. Yud vav nun is the same last three letters of the word for logic, higayon. There it's hey gimel, yud vav nun. So intellect and imagination are sharing actually the letters of Yavan, of Greece, because Greece represents pure intellect and logic, but it lacks the prophetic type of experience. And so, as we said, dimayon is dam. When dam, which represents the passions and in a low state of lust, but when this energy, the energy of the nachash, is fixed and refined, it becomes the highest source of Mashiach. It becomes the revealed and rectified level of Mashiach. Now, each and every one of us has this these forces within us, and they can either, like the Yetzer Hara, drag us down, as represented by dam, or it could raise us up to become a fitting vessel for prophecy. So one other thing is that along with the word for imagination being dimayon, along with dam, these two letters are also the root of what's called domeh. Domeh in Hebrew means to be like, to understand similarities, to see connections, to understanding metaphor and allegory and symbolism. And there's a verse in Isaiah, I believe it's 14:14, where he says, Adameh le'elyon. I will, the first part of the verse is, I will elevate myself like on the mountain. Adameh le'elyon, and I will be compared to the Most High. And of course, this is part of the word Adam, a human being. And as we've said many times, Adam, the Aleph of Adam, is the divine soul. And the Dam, the blood, is the body. And so a human being is a composite of both forces. And so the power of imagination is the power to make connections, leaps of thought process, to be able to jump from one idea to another and tie them all together. That's the power of imagination. And that's why when God granted a prophet a vision, the vision is coming through in like pictorial symbolism. And when the prophet comes out of the vision, it's clear. But then the prophet's imagination has to take these symbols and translate them into words that other people can understand. And that's the power of imagination that Rambam and the Ramchal are talking about. And so it can start through the intellect, but it's dependent on this ability. And it's not just an intellectual ability to make similarities. It has to come from a much, much deeper type of wisdom. And so here I'm going to connect to one more idea. And before I do it, just to wrap this up, the reason I got into this whole idea of prophecy is because when the letters of the Choshen Mishpat would light up, this was a state of prophecy. And it was dependent on the Kohen Gadol being a clear vessel. Later on, when the whole temple experience really descended, and you could buy the high priesthood through money, it didn't work anymore. It was only when someone like Aaron a Cohen and some of the priests in the first temple were on the level that the Choshen Mishpat actually worked. And so in this week's Parsha, and it's repeated a few other times because we have more Torah portions coming that are dealing with the Mishkan. And this is the term Chachmei Lev, where it talks about that the people, the artisans who made the Mishkan, they were those who had wisdom of the heart. So in next week's Parsha, it comes in this week's Parsha, this idea, the ones that were making the vestments, the clothing of the Kohanim. So it's in chapter 28, verse 3. It says, V'ata, God is speaking to Moshe, Tidaber el kol chachmei lev. Speak to all of those who have wisdom in their heart. Asher miletiv, that I will fill them with a ruach of chachma, a spirit of wisdom. Vasu et bigdei Aaron lekadsho lekahaen li. That they will make the clothings of Aaron, and he will administer for me, lekahano li. And in next week's parsha, it repeats this idea that the artisans were called the ones with wisdom in their heart. So here I'm just connecting this because we're talking about prophecy coming through the intellect, but just passing through it to the imaginative faculty. But the way to fix the imaginative faculty is through the intellect. And that's what the Alter Rebbe said, that the moach shalit al alev, the intellect has to rule over the heart and the lower drives of a human being. And so here we just see just a beautiful connection, what's called the wisdom of the heart. And that's why the Alter Rebbe, who was very, very strong on the intellect, that's why Chabad is a acronym for Chachma, Bina, and Dat, wisdom, understanding, and knowledge. These are faculties of the mind. But the Alter Rebbe said that there are times when the wisdom of the heart must be listened to, that it reaches a higher place than just the pure intellect. But here we're saying that there's even a deeper wisdom in what we'll call the gut. And this is, we're told that the word melech, king, applies to each person. The mem of melech is moach, the brain, the intellect. The Lamed of Melech is Lev, the heart. And the Chaf of Melech are the Klayot, the kidneys. And it says about Avram Avinu that Avram Avinu and the other patriarchs and matriarchs kept the whole Torah even before it was given. So the question is, how did they know? And so the sages say that Avram's kidneys were like buckets of water and pouring forth a type of wisdom that was so instinctual, so inspirational, that he could truly connect to the wisdom of the Torah even before it was given. He just picked up on it from the depths of his being. So this is the root of prophecy. This is the place where the Kohen Gadol had to be in for the Choshen Mishpat to work. And in the Tikkunei Zohar, there's a section called Petach de Eliyahu, the opening that Eliyahu and Navi spoke out. And it's all about the 10 Sfirot. It appears in many Sidurim before Kabbalat Shabbat. And many people say this before Kabbalat Shabbat every week. And in it are symbolic terms or names for the different Sfirot. And when it gets to Bina, it says, Bina liba uba halev yavin. That Bina is understanding. It's one of the intellectual faculties, one of the intellectual Sfirot. But it says, Bina liba, Bina, the understanding of the heart. And through it, the heart understands. So here we see a beautiful unity of the wisdom of the mind and the wisdom of the heart. And that prophecy and divine inspiration actually combines the wisdom of the mind, the heart, and the inside of our gut, instinctual, inspirational, inside of the insides. Because that's what Reb Shlomo used to say, the inside of the inside. So we should all be blessed. We should all be blessed with this Chachma of the Lev, Chachmei Lev. And may, through the study of the Mishkan, that we should merit to see the building of the third temple soon and in our days. L'chaim, everyone. L'chaim. L'chaim. Okay, thank you everyone again for your patience at the beginning. First I have to, first